never thought something like this could happen to me. Hell, who does? When the news broke about the guy in Asheville who got tortured in his basement by home invaders, I was shocked, sure. But scared? Nah, stuff like that doesn't happen to regular people like me, right? The news painted a grim picture. This guy, a local jeweler, had his home broken into by some masked thugs. They were after a stash of diamonds they thought he kept on site. Turns out there were no diamonds, just an empty safe in his bedroom closet. But these guys didn't believe him. They tortured him for hours, thinking he'd eventually crack. The poor guy barely made it. If not for a nosy neighbor calling the cops, he wouldn't have. It was the kind of story you shake your head at. Maybe say a prayer for the guy. But that's it. It never once crossed my mind that I'd be next. I wasn't a jeweler. I wasn't sitting on a pile of cash. The only thing I had that was worth anything was a coin collection my grandpa left me when he passed. A few rare gold and silver pieces from the 1800s, nothing crazy. I'd had it appraised last year, $25,000, tops. Nice to have, but not life-changing. Looking back now, I see how stupid I was. That appraiser must have let it slip to the wrong person. That's probably how they found me. It was a lazy Saturday afternoon. I was slouched on my couch, flipping between football games and mindlessly scrolling on my phone. The sun was shining through the blinds and everything felt normal, safe. That was the last time I'd feel that way. Around 2 p.m., a loud crash shattered the quiet. At first I thought it was just my cat knocking something over, but then I heard it again. Glass breaking, this time louder. My heart jumped into my throat. I peeked around the corner just in time to see 3 masked figures pouring into my living room through the front door, which was now hanging off its hinges. They were on me in seconds, guns raised, shouting orders I could barely process. On your knees. Hands up. My body reacted before my brain caught up and I dropped to the floor. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. My mouth went dry, my hands trembling as I tried to figure out what to say. One of them, the tallest of the group, leaned down and snarled, "Where's the safe?" My mind blanked. Safe? What safe? Then it hit me. They were after my grandpa's coins. I don't have a safe, I stammered, trying to sound convincing. The shortest of the 3 wasn't buying it. He smacked me across the face with the barrel of his pistol, hard enough to split my lip. "Don't lie to us," he hissed. "Where is it?" I tasted blood as I scrambled for an answer. "I swear I don't know what you're talking about." My voice cracked and I hated how pathetic I sounded. But I wasn't about to hand over my grandpa's collection. Not yet, anyway. "Search the house," the tall one barked. The other 2 split up, tearing through my belongings while I knelt there, shaking and bleeding on my living room floor. And that's when I realized I wasn't getting out of this unscathed. It didn't take them long to find the safe. I had hidden it under a loose floorboard in the bedroom closet, a decent spot, but not enough to fool someone tearing the place apart. The shorter guy came back downstairs, a smug grin behind his mask. "Found it," he said, tossing the floorboard onto the carpet like it was nothing. The tall one turned to me. "Combination. Now." I froze. My mind screamed at me to give it up, to just hand them the coins and pray they'd leave. But I couldn't do it. It wasn't just about the money. That collection was a piece of my family, a legacy. My grandpa spent decades putting it together, and it felt like handing it over would be the same as giving up on him. "I don't know it." I lied. The room went silent, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. The tall one knelt down in front of me, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "You think this is a game?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Before I could answer, the short guy stepped forward and slammed the butt of his pistol into my ribs. Pain exploded through my side and I crumpled to the floor. "You're gonna give us that combination?" the short one sneered. "The only question is how much it's gonna hurt first." They dragged me down to the basement, the damp, unfinished room where I kept old boxes and junk I hadn't touched in years. The concrete floor was cold against my knees as they tied my hands behind my back, the rope biting into my skin. One of them stuffed a rag into my mouth, cutting off my protests. "This'll loosen his tongue," the tall one said, holding up a hammer. My stomach dropped. I tried to scream, to beg, but the rag muffled my voice. The first blow came down on my left hand, and the pain was like nothing I'd ever felt before. White hot and searing, it shot up my arm and into my skull. I thought I might pass out, but they didn't stop. The second blow came down on my right hand. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. My world narrowed to that tiny, suffocating basement, and the agony tearing through my body. By the time they moved onto my feet, I was barely conscious. I couldn't even fight back anymore. They wanted me broken, and they were getting their wish. The hammer came down again and again, and all I could do was scream into the gag and pray for it to stop. Finally, they paused. The tall one knelt down in front of me, his voice sharp and cold. "You ready to talk now?" he asked. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. They yanked the gag out and I gasped for air, my voice shaking as I tried to form words. The combination," I stammered, the numbers spilling out of my mouth before I could think twice. The tall one smirked, standing up and nodding to his partners. "Go check it," he said, and the other two headed upstairs. For a moment, the basement was eerily quiet. I could hear them opening the safe, rummaging through its contents. Then there was shouting, followed by heavy footsteps coming back down the stairs. The short one stormed into the room, furious. "It's just coins," he yelled. "This is what we came for, a bunch of old coins?" I braced myself for another beating, but the tall one raised a hand, stopping him. "Enough," he said. "Let's just take what we can and go." They huddled in the corner, arguing in hushed tones. My mind raced. Were they going to kill me, leave me here? I couldn't tell. My hands throbbed. My feet felt like they were on fire, and I was so cold I couldn't stop shaking. All I could do was wait and hope someone would find me before it was too late. The hours after they left felt like days. I didn't even hear them go. One second they were arguing in the corner, and the next, the basement was silent. My head lolled forward as exhaustion and pain dragged me in and out of consciousness. The smell of damp concrete and coppery blood was all around me. The rope binding my wrists dug deeper into my raw skin every time I shifted. I wanted to scream for help, but my throat was so dry I could barely whisper. I thought about my dad, about the afternoons he'd spent showing me each coin in his collection. He'd tell me their stories, where they came from, and why they mattered. "It's not about the value," he'd say, running a thumb over the faded edges of a coin. "It's about the history." That history now felt like a curse. If I'd sold those damn coins, none of this would have happened. Time lost all meaning down there. At some point I realized the house was eerily quiet. I couldn't hear the creak of the floorboards or the slam of the front door. It hit me. They were gone. Maybe they'd gotten what they wanted and decided to leave me for dead. I wasn't sure if I was more relieved or terrified. My body begged me to pass out to escape the pain, but the thought of dying alone in that basement kept me awake. I focused on the faint hope that someone would notice I was missing. That's when I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling my name. At first I thought I was hallucinating, but the voice grew louder, clearer. "Dad?" It was my son. I tried to answer, but all that came out was a low, rasping sound. My head drooped forward as footsteps echoed above me. "Dad, are you here?" His voice was frantic now, and I could hear him running through the house, throwing doors open. Finally, I heard him on the basement stairs. "Oh my God," he whispered when he saw me. I'll never forget the look on his face. Pure horror. He rushed to my side, his hands trembling as he worked at the knots. "It's okay. I've got you. Just hold on." As soon as my hands were free, I collapsed against him. "They're gone," I managed to croak. He nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. "I already called the cops. They're on their way." The rest of the night was a blur of flashing lights, uniformed officers, and paramedics swarming around me. My son never left my side, his hand gripping mine like he was afraid I'd disappear. For the first time in hours, I felt safe. The hospital became my home for the next few weeks. My injuries were worse than I'd realized. Multiple fractures in my hands and feet, deep bruises, and a nasty case of dehydration. I went through surgery after surgery, and even after they were done, I was looking at months of physical therapy. But I was alive. That thought alone kept me going. My son visited every day, and each time he walked through the door, I was reminded of how lucky I was. If he hadn't been so stubborn, if he hadn't driven all the way to my house just to yell at me for not answering his calls, I don't even want to think about how it could have ended. The cops caught the guys a few months later. They'd been trying to pawn off my grandpa's coins in some shady shop across town. Most of the collection was gone by then, sold off piece by piece, but a few had been recovered. The tall one, the leader, got 35 years. The other two weren't far behind him. Knowing they were locked up brought some peace, but it didn't erase what they'd done. I tried going back to work after I recovered, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. The whole experience changed me. I sold what was left of the coin collection and moved down south, away from the cold winters that made my injuries ache. These days I spend my time fishing, hiking, and enjoying the little things I used to take for granted. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry about what happened, if I hate the men who did this to me, and honestly, I don't. They took a lot from me, sure, but they also gave me something I didn't have before: perspective. Life is short. It's messy and painful, but it's also beautiful. I wouldn't trade another second of it for all the coins in the world. So if you're listening to this, do me a favor. Call your family, hug them a little tighter, and don't waste a single day. Trust me, you never know how many you've got left. If you've ever driven through South Dakota, you've probably seen houses like this one, standing alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of nothing but wind-swept plains. At first glance, it looked ordinary, even welcoming. But trust me, it was anything but. When my family moved there, I was just a kid, too young to sense the undercurrent of something wrong. My parents were ecstatic, calling it a fresh start in a community that shared their faith. The house we moved into was part of a compound, a collection of modest buildings centered around a chapel. The leader of this place, a man everyone called the Holy Father, was a preacher with a voice so smooth it could make the devil weep. To me, though, he was just a shadowy figure, always watching from the pulpit. "He's guiding us," my mom said one night as she tucked me in. "We're so lucky to be here." She didn't see the way his eyes lingered on people, the way they avoided his gaze like looking too long would cost them something. Then there was the basement. I'd never seen it, but I'd heard the whispers about boys disappearing down there once they hit a certain age. When I asked about it, my dad just said, "You'll understand when you're older." I didn't realize how soon that would be. The Holy Father wasn't like other preachers. He didn't just teach about God. He was God in his own eyes. His sermon centered on Mary Magdalene, who he claimed was the true leader of the Christian faith. According to him, her bloodline had been passed down through the ages, culminating in him. It sounds ridiculous now, but to the 100 or so people who still lived on the compound, it was gospel. My parents believed every word, and they weren't alone. The Holy Father's charisma was magnetic. He could twist scripture to justify anything, and his followers would nod along like it all made sense. The community itself was self-sufficient, with everyone pitching in. We grew our food, made our clothes, and spent our days working to keep the compound running. There was no room for questioning. If you didn't fit into the Holy Father's vision of a perfect world, you were cast out. For boys like me, that meant one thing: the basement. I was 13 when they sent me down. I still remember the way the stairs creaked under my feet as I descended into the dark. The basement wasn't what I expected. It was worse. The air was damp and heavy, the walls lined with crude beds made from old mattresses and cinder blocks. A single naked bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me. There were 5 of us down there. Chris, the oldest, had been there the longest. Then there was Sam, quiet but kind, and Mike, who tried to make jokes to keep our spirits up. The last was Kyle, who barely spoke at all, Welcome to the pit, Chris said, his voice low. Don't get too comfortable. Life in the basement was simple but brutal. We were up at dawn, working the fields or fixing fences until our bodies ached. Evenings were spent in silence, too tired to talk. Sundays were supposed to be a day of rest, but unless you volunteered for extra work, you were stuck in the basement. For your own good, the Holy Father would say. We knew better. Over time, I began to notice things, small, unsettling details that hinted at something darker. Sometimes I'd catch whispers from the older women about sins in the basement. Once, while cleaning tools in the barn, I overheard the Holy Father speaking with one of his closest followers. We must keep them disciplined, he said. Idle hands invite the devil. But it wasn't just discipline. Chris told me about punishments. Things that happened in the dead of night when the rest of us were too scared to move. You don't ever want to give them a reason, he warned. His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. The worst part was the sense of hopelessness. We talked about escaping, but where would we go? The compound was miles from the nearest town, and without money or connections, we'd never make it. We're stuck, Mike said one night, his voice shaking. This place owns us. Sarah was the Holy Father's daughter, and to everyone else, she was untouchable. But there was something about her that didn't fit the mold. She asked questions, lingered in places she shouldn't, and seemed to watch the basement with a kind of quiet curiosity. One night, Chris found a note tucked under his mattress. We need to talk, it read. Midnight, barn. We thought it was a trap, but Chris went anyway. When he came back, he was pale but determined. She wants to help, he said. She knows what's going on. Over the next few weeks, Sarah began to unravel the Holy Father's carefully constructed lies. She found records of punishments, secret bank accounts, and letters that hinted at more sinister activities. But it wasn't just paperwork. Sarah had a personal reason to turn against her father. She had fallen in love with Chris. Their relationship was forbidden, but it gave her the courage to act. Sarah's plan was dangerous. She'd been meeting with a lawyer in town, passing along copies of the documents she found. The authorities were building a case, but it wasn't enough. We need proof, she told us one night. Something they can't ignore. Chris decided we'd document our conditions. We smuggled an old camera into the basement and took photos of the damp walls, the broken beds, and the bruises some of us carried. It felt like a small rebellion, but it gave us hope. Then the Holy Father got suspicious. He started making surprise inspections, his eyes scanning every corner of the basement like he could sense the rebellion brewing. We're running out of time, Sarah warned. If he finds out, we're all dead. The night it all fell apart, the air was electric with tension. Sarah had arranged for the police to raid the compound, but something tipped the Holy Father off. He gathered the congregation in the chapel, locking the doors behind them. We could hear his voice booming through the walls, filled with fury and desperation. Then came the sound of sirens. Blue and red lights flashed through the small basement window, and for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. Chris grabbed the hidden camera and whispered, "This is it. Stay close." The police stormed the compound, breaking down doors and shouting commands. When they found us in the basement, the look on the officer's face was one I'll never forget. A mix of horror and disbelief. "You're safe now," he said. "Come with me." The aftermath was a blur. The Holy Father was arrested, charged with fraud, abuse, and a slew of other crimes. The documents Sarah provided were enough to dismantle the compound, but the full extent of what happened there was quietly buried. They said it was to protect us, but part of me thinks it was to protect themselves, from the shame of knowing they hadn't seen it sooner. As for Sarah, she disappeared after the trial. Chris said she moved out west, starting a new life far from the shadow of her father's sins. I hope she found peace. She deserves it. The rest of us? We're still healing. Some scars never fade, but we're free now. Free to live, to love, and to dream. When I look at my daughter Sarah, I think about the woman who saved us. I hope my Sarah grows up to be just as brave, just as strong. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. No matter how dark the shadows, there's always a light waiting to guide you home. Growing up, the basement in our house always had this off feeling. It wasn't creepy exactly, just weird, cold, quiet, and too big for its own good. It was the kind of place where every sound echoed, and the shadows always seemed darker than they should be. My parents didn't think much of it. To them, it was just a practical space for storage and the occasional workout session. Then there was Max, our cat. Max had a nightly tradition. Every evening, like clockwork, my parents would scoop him up, carry him to the basement, and shut the door. They hated the fur he'd leave all over their bed, and since he was part outdoor cat, they figured the basement was the best place to keep him at night. For years, Max didn't seem to mind. He'd settle in quickly, maybe let out a small meow at the door, and then he'd disappear into the shadows of the basement, finding a cozy spot on the couch or under the stairs. But 2 weeks ago, all of that changed. One night, I carried Max to the basement as usual. He didn't fight me, but as soon as I set him down on the landing, he froze. He just stood there, staring down into the dark like he saw something I couldn't. I nudged him gently, but he didn't budge. His ears flattened and his tail twitched. It was weird. He'd never done that before. I shrugged it off, shut the door, and headed to the kitchen for some water. That's when I heard it. Max's meow. It wasn't his usual soft cry. It was loud, almost frantic. I went back to check, thinking maybe his food bowl was empty. When I opened the door, he bolted past me like he was running from something. His food bowl was full. Over the next few nights, Max's behavior only got stranger. I'd put him on the landing, shut the door, and within minutes he'd start meowing again. It was this desperate, almost pleading sound that made my skin crawl. Then my dad started noticing something odd. He'd find the basement door wide open in the morning, even though we always made sure to close it at night. At first, he blamed my sister. She has this habit of leaving doors open, drawers too. But when she swore it wasn't her, he got frustrated. Maybe the latch is loose, he muttered one morning, fiddling with the doorknob. I wanted to believe that, but the door wasn't just unlocked. It was wide open, like someone had deliberately pushed it. One night I stayed up late playing video games in my room when I heard the door creak. My room's near the staircase, so I peeked into the hallway. I could see the basement door, slowly swinging open. Nobody was there. I tried to convince myself it was the air pressure in the house or something, but Max's reaction said otherwise. He was crouched near the door, his fur bristling and his eyes fixed on the dark opening. A couple of nights later, I woke up to a strange sound, soft, almost rhythmic. At first I thought it was just the house settling, but then I realized it was coming from the hallway. Rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I glanced toward my door, which I always left slightly open. There, in the faint glow of the hallway light, I saw a figure. It was just standing there, completely still. At first I thought it was my sister, but something about the silhouette was off. It was too tall, too thin. "Claire?" I whispered, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned slowly and disappeared around the corner, toward the basement stairs. My heart was racing, but I was too scared to follow. I stayed frozen in bed, staring at the door until morning. The next day, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. On the hardwood floor near the basement door, there were faint, muddy footprints. They weren't mine, and they definitely weren't my sister's. By this point, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong with the basement. Max refused to go near it, and the door kept opening on its own. I decided to investigate. When I opened the basement door, I was hit by a wave of damp, musty air. But beneath that, there was something else, a faint, putrid smell. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down, each step creaking under my weight. The smell grew stronger as I moved toward the storage room in the back corner. When I opened the door, my stomach turned. The room was filled with trash, empty food wrappers, soda cans, and what looked like an old, filthy blanket. It wasn't just trash, it was a nest. I backed out of the room, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Someone had been living down here, and they hadn't been gone for long. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump, and Max stayed curled up on my bed, his ears twitching. Around midnight, I noticed a light flickering under my door. It wasn't the steady glow of the hallway lamp, it was erratic, like someone was flipping the switch on and off. My heart pounded as I sat up, staring at the light. I told myself it was just my dad getting up for water, but the flickering went on for too long. Summoning what little courage I had, I crept to the door and cracked it open. The hallway was empty, but the light was still flickering. Slowly, I peeked toward the basement stairs. The light switch at the top of the stairs was moving. Click, 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 but there was no one there. I slammed my door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. The next day, I told my dad what I'd seen. He brushed it off, saying it was probably a wiring issue, but I couldn't let it go. After school, I grabbed a flashlight and went back to the basement. The smell was worse than ever, almost unbearable. It led me to the crawl space in the storage room, a small dark opening that connected to the house's plumbing. We never used it. It was too cramped and unfinished. As I got closer, I heard it, breathing. It was faint, but steady, coming from deep within the crawl space. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. The breathing stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, out of the darkness, a hand shot out, filthy and claw-like. I screamed and stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. By the time I scrambled to my feet and shined the light again, the crawl space was empty. I didn't wait to see if they'd come back. I ran upstairs and told my parents everything. This time, they listened. The police arrived later that night and searched the basement. They found the nest in the storage room, along with a pile of clothes and more food wrappers shoved into the crawl space. But what really freaked them out were the messages scrawled on the crawl space walls. Written in black charcoal were dozens of phrases like, "I see you and don't lock me out." One of them was fresher than the others. "Thank you for letting me stay." Whoever had been down there was long gone, escaping through the storm door at the back of the basement, but the thought of how long they'd been watching us living under our feet still keeps me up at night. We've kept the basement door locked ever since, but sometimes late at night I think I hear it creak. And Max? He still won't go near the door. It was about 5 years ago when my family finally caught a break. After years of bouncing between apartments and friends' couches, Mom landed a job at a reputable lock factory in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It wasn't her dream job, but it paid enough for us to rent a small house on the outskirts of town. When we first pulled into the driveway, I remember staring at the house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest white 2-bedroom with a creaky porch and a patchy lawn. But to me, it was perfect. Stability had been a stranger to us for too long, and for the first time I felt like we were finally putting roots down. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with working-class families and the occasional kid riding a bike or shooting hoops. For my younger brother Ethan and me, it was the closest thing to normal we'd had since Dad passed away when I was 10. The first few weeks went by smoothly. Mom was working long hours. Ethan and I were settling into school, and the house, though old and a bit drafty, felt like a sanctuary. But as I look back now, I can see the small cracks in that piece, the subtle signs that all was not as it seemed. It started with little things. A faint creak in the hallway late at night. A soft tapping sound coming from the kitchen. Ethan noticed it first and mentioned it over breakfast one morning. "I think the house is haunted," he said, his mouth full of cereal. Mom and I laughed it off. "It's just the house settling," she said. "Old houses make noises." But as the days went on, the noises became harder to ignore. They weren't loud, just subtle enough to get under your skin. A faint scratching sound in the walls, like something trying to claw its way out. The sound of a door creaking when no one was there. One night, as I lay in bed, I swore I heard whispering. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. It was faint, so faint I thought I might be imagining it, but it was there. A soft, breathy murmur that sent chills down my spine. When I mentioned it to Mom the next morning, she waved it off. "You've been watching too many scary movies," she said. But Ethan looked at me with wide eyes. "I heard it too," he whispered. The noises were unnerving, but what came next was worse. It started with small things. Food disappearing from the fridge, items not being where we left them. At first, I thought it was Ethan. He had a bad habit of sneaking snacks and leaving the wrappers under his bed. But one night, after we'd all gone to bed, I heard the fridge door creak open. I crept out of my room expecting to catch Ethan red-handed. But when I got to the kitchen, it was empty. The fridge door was slightly ajar, and a half-eaten sandwich sat on the counter. "Ethan, is this your idea of a joke?" I hissed. He peeked out of his room, bleary-eyed. "What are you talking about?" The next morning, Mom noticed the missing food and blamed me. "You need to stop sneaking food at night," she said. "It wasn't me," I protested. Ethan backed me up, but Mom didn't believe us. It created a tension in the house that made the strange noises even harder to ignore. One weekend, Mom decided we needed to clean out the basement. She'd been storing boxes down there since we moved in, and she wanted to make space for a washer and dryer. The basement was dark and damp, with a faint smell of mildew. As we moved boxes around, I noticed something odd, a small square hatch in the corner of the room. It was partially hidden behind a pile of old newspapers. "Mom, did you know this was here?" I asked. She frowned. "No, it's probably just a crawl space. Don't mess with it." But I couldn't help myself. I crouched down and tried to open the hatch, but it wouldn't budge. The latch was rusted shut. That night, the noises were louder than ever. A faint tapping sound echoed through the house, followed by a low, groaning creak that made my skin crawl. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew better. It was a Friday night when everything changed. Mom was working late, and Ethan and I were home alone. I was in the living room scrolling through my phone when I heard a loud thud from the basement. My stomach dropped. "Did you hear that?" I asked Ethan. He nodded, his face pale. "What was it?" I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the basement door. My hands were shaking as I turned the knob. The door creaked open and I shone the light down the stairs. At first I didn't see anything, but as I took a step closer, the beam of light caught something. Two pale eyes staring up at me from the bottom of the stairs. I froze. The eyes blinked, and then the figure melted back into the darkness. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "There's someone down there," I whispered to Ethan. 2 days later, Ethan came home early from school. Mom and I weren't home, so he let himself in and went to the kitchen to grab a snack. As he opened the fridge, he heard a soft rustling behind him. "Mom," he called out. No answer. When he turned around, he saw a man standing in the doorway. He was tall and thin, with wild, unkempt hair and hollow eyes. His clothes were filthy, and he reeked of sweat and mildew. Ethan screamed and bolted out the front door, running straight to our neighbor's house. The police were called, and by the time we got home, the street was swarming with squad cars. The police searched the house and found what we'd been too afraid to confront. In the basement, hidden behind a stack of boxes, they discovered a small living area. A thin mattress, a pile of blankets, and empty food wrappers littered the floor. It was clear the man had been living there for weeks, maybe even months. He'd carved a small hole into the crawl space to sneak in and out, listening to us and stealing food when we weren't around. The discovery shook us to our core. The idea that someone had been living under our noses, watching us, knowing our routines, it was horrifying. We moved out that same week. Mom found us a small apartment in a building with no basement, and we tried to rebuild our lives. Ethan had nightmares for months, and I developed a habit of checking every closet corner and dark space in every room I entered. The police never caught the man. We never even learned his name. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering if he's out there, hiding in someone else's basement, waiting for the right moment to strike. Maybe he's in yours. I never planned on working at a 24-hour diner in one of the shadiest parts of Detroit. But when you're drowning in student loans and your savings are down to loose change, you take what you can get. The place was called Rusty's Diner, a neon-lit hole in the wall that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, or at least some of them. Javier, the manager, was a tough guy to figure out. He wasn't outwardly mean, but he had this constant air of unease, like he was keeping secrets. His slicked-back hair, tired eyes, and chain-smoking habit made him seem more like someone who'd fit in running shady deals in a back alley than a diner. But I couldn't afford to judge. My first few shifts were rough. Midnight to 8 a.m., cleaning grease traps, flipping burgers for the occasional drunk, and trying not to fall asleep. But it wasn't the exhaustion or the creepy customers that got to me. It was the silence. The diner had this heavy, oppressive quiet at night, like the walls were holding their breath. The first time I noticed something strange was about a week in. I was mopping the kitchen floor when I heard it, this faint, muffled thud coming from below the floor. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but then came the scraping, like metal dragging across concrete. I froze, mop in hand, and listened. The sounds continued for a few seconds before fading into silence. I shook it off, chalking it up to my imagination, but that uneasy feeling stayed with me for the rest of the night. By the third night, the noises became impossible to ignore. The thuds and scraping grew louder, and now there was a strange rhythmic tapping mixed in. When I brought it up to Javier, he barely looked up from his newspaper. "Old building," he said, blowing out a cloud of smoke. "Pipes make noise, don't worry about it." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't press him. Javier didn't seem like the kind of guy you argued with. One night, curiosity got the better of me. After finishing my shift, I walked around the back of the diner where I'd noticed a set of window wells partially buried in dirt. I crouched down and tried to peer through the glass, but it was too grimy to see much. Just as I was about to give up, a faint light flickered on inside the basement, illuminating what looked like a cluttered storage area. I leaned closer, squinting to make out the details, when something moved. It was fast, too fast, and before I could process what I'd seen, the light snapped off. I stumbled back, my heart racing. Whatever was down there wasn't just pipes or rats. I didn't know what it was, but I was determined to find out. The next night, I worked up the nerve to confront Javier. "There's something down there," I said, trying to sound confident. "I saw movement in the basement. What's going on?" He gave me this long, hard look before leaning back in his chair. "There is no basement," he said flatly. I almost laughed. "Come on, I've seen the window wells. There's a basement." His jaw tightened. "It's sealed off. Has been for years. There's nothing down there." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just dismissive, it was a warning. But I couldn't let it go. After my shift, I found a set of keys Javier had left behind and took my chance. The trapdoor in the pantry opened with a loud creak, revealing a narrow staircase leading into darkness. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint smell of damp earth and mildew hit me hard. My flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness, but as I reached the bottom, I saw it. A cramped, musty basement with chains bolted to the walls and scratch marks etched into the concrete. My stomach turned as I noticed more details. An old mattress on the floor, a table covered in rusted tools, and a stack of newspapers with headlines about missing people. I was so focused on the newspapers that I almost didn't notice the figure in the corner. It was a man. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his hair wild and matted. He was sitting on the floor, staring at me with wide, yellow eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Before I could react, he stood up, his movements jerky and unnatural. He smiled at me, a twisted, demented grin that made my blood run cold. "Help me," he said, his voice hoarse and broken. Then he lunged, I screamed and bolted up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut and locking it behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the keys. I didn't sleep that night, and when I went back the next day, Javier was waiting for me. "You went down there, didn't you?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. Javier sat me down in the empty diner, his expression grim. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said, lighting a cigarette. "But now that you have, I need you to listen." He explained that the man in the basement was his brother, Alex. Alex had been dangerous for years, violent, unpredictable, but Javier couldn't bring himself to let him go. So when the diner's previous owner sealed off the basement, Javier saw it as the perfect place to keep Alex hidden from the world. "I give him food, keep him alive," Javier said, exhaling smoke. "But he can't leave. It's better this way." I wanted to scream at him, to call the cops right then and there, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He wasn't just protecting Alex, he was scared of him. I tried to quit the next day, but Javier wouldn't let me. "You need this job," he said, "and I need you to keep your mouth shut." For weeks I stayed away from the basement, but the noises continued. Then, one night after closing, I saw movement in the tree line near the parking lot. It was Alex. He was standing there watching me, his yellow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I pretended not to see him and walked to my car, my heart pounding. But as I fumbled with my keys, I heard footsteps. I turned to see Alex charging at me, his grin wider than ever. I barely got into my car before he slammed his hands against the window, smearing it with dirt and sweat. I hit the gas and sped away, leaving him screaming in the parking lot. The next morning, I called the police. They raided the diner that afternoon, finding Alex in the basement along with the evidence I'd seen. Javier was arrested for endangering his brother and obstructing justice, but the news didn't bring me any peace. I moved out of Detroit soon after, but sometimes late at night, I still hear those faint thuds and scraping sounds. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down I know I'll never escape the memory of Alex's twisted grin. I was 10 when it happened, and even now thinking about it sends chills down my spine. My family had this tradition of turning our old Victorian house in Salem, Massachusetts, into a haunted house every Halloween. Living in Salem, where every corner feels like it's haunted already, our house fit the vibe perfectly. Creaky wooden floors, dim lights, and this draft in the basement that made the air feel heavy. Perfectly spooky. My parents always went all out for Halloween. They'd decorate the basement with fake cobwebs, strobe lights, and creepy props, making it the highlight of the neighborhood. The twist? It wasn't just for fun. To get in, people had to donate canned food, which my parents would give to the local food bank. I loved the chaos of those nights. My friends would come over running and screaming through the decorations while my cousins, dressed in creepy costumes, jumped out to scare everyone. This particular year, though, felt different. It started in the afternoon when a man showed up at our door with a bag of canned goods. He wasn't like the usual parents or kids who came by. He looked rough, with a scruffy beard and a jacket that seemed a size too big for him. He said he wanted to drop off the food early because his wife and daughter would join later. My mom thanked him, but I could tell she was uneasy. Something about the way he smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. My dad brushed it off, saying it was just a generous gesture. Still, the guy gave me the creeps. By evening, the basement was packed. Kids and parents were lining up to go through the haunted house. My cousins, dressed in identical white masks with blank, creepy expressions, were hiding in corners waiting to jump out. The energy was electric. Screams echoed through the basement, followed by laughter. It was all going great, until it wasn't. In the middle of the fun, one of my friends ran up to me, crying. She was shaking so hard she could barely get her words out. "Someone grabbed me," she said, her voice trembling. "What? Who?" I asked, confused. "It was one of those people in the masks," she said, pointing toward the basement. "He grabbed my wrist and tried to pull me into that closet over there." My stomach sank. I tried to reassure her. telling her it was probably one of my cousins pulling a prank, but she shook her head violently. No, it wasn't them. He whispered something. Don't scream. It wasn't a joke. Her fear was real, and it started to infect me. I ran to my parents and told them what she said. They immediately called my cousins up from the basement. Jeff, Rick, and Chaz all swore they hadn't done anything like that. They were sticking to their usual spots, scaring people and handing out candy. But then we realized something. Eric, my fourth cousin, wasn't there. When Eric finally showed up, he looked annoyed. I just went to the bathroom, and when I came back, my mask was gone. He said, I thought one of you guys was messing with me. That's when my parents knew something wasn't right. They shut the haunted house down immediately, telling everyone to leave while they called the police. The officers searched the basement and the rest of the house but didn't find anything or anyone. The party was over, but the unease wasn't. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. My friend's face, pale and terrified, kept flashing in my mind. Eric losing his mask felt too convenient, too coincidental. Something wasn't adding up. My parents tried to reassure me before bed, saying the police hadn't found anything, so there was no reason to worry. But their voices had that edge to them, the one adults get when they're trying to convince themselves as much as you. I laid in bed for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. Around midnight, just as I was finally starting to drift off, I heard it. A faint tapping sound. At first I thought I was imagining it, but it kept going. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from my window. I froze, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would break through my chest. My room was on the second floor. There was no way anyone could be outside my window. But the sound continued, soft, but deliberate, like someone was knocking. I wanted to scream for my parents, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. Instead, I pulled the covers over my head, squeezing my eyes shut and praying it would stop. Eventually, the tapping faded, and I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I told my parents about the noise, but they brushed it off, saying it was probably just a tree branch or the wind. But I knew better. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, it wasn't just tapping. I woke up to a scratching noise like nails dragging against wood. It was louder, more insistent, and it was definitely coming from my window. Fear turned into anger. I was tired of being scared, tired of feeling like a prisoner in my own house. Without thinking, I threw off the covers and marched to the window. I yanked the curtains open, and that's when I saw it. A man in a white mask was standing there, pressed against the glass. The blank expression of the mask was just inches from my face, but what terrified me most were his eyes. Dark, hollow, and staring straight into mine. I screamed louder than I ever had in my life. My parents burst into the room seconds later, but by the time they got there, he was gone. My dad grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, yelling into the night while my mom held me, trying to calm me down. The police came again, searching the yard and the surrounding area, but they found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign anyone had even been there. But I knew what I saw. My parents didn't take any chances after that. They installed security cameras and alarms, locking every door and window in the house. For a while, it seemed to work. Weeks passed and life started to feel normal again. I almost convinced myself it was over, until I found the mask. It was a Friday afternoon when I came home from school. The day felt normal, almost boring, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't obsessing over shadows or noises in the night. But all that changed the second I walked into my room. Lying on my bed was a white mask. Not just any mask, the same blank, creepy mask my cousins had worn during the haunted house. My heart sank. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my feet stayed glued to the floor. I stared at the mask, trying to convince myself it was some sort of prank. Maybe one of my cousins had left it there as a joke. But then I saw it. Scrawled across the forehead in messy black Sharpie was my name. I don't remember much after that. My hands started shaking and I bolted downstairs yelling for my parents. They ran to my room, and when my dad saw the mask, his face went pale. My mom just kept saying, "This isn't possible. How could this happen?" We called the police. Again. They searched the house from top to bottom and reviewed the security footage, but nothing showed up. No one had come in or out of the house. How did it get there? I kept asking. My parents had no answers. That night, my dad stayed up, pacing the house with a baseball bat in hand while my mom stayed in my room, refusing to let me out of her sight. I didn't sleep. Every sound, every shadow made me jump. I kept imagining those dark eyes staring through the mask, watching me. Weeks passed and the fear became a dull ache in the back of my mind. The cameras, alarms, and extra locks seemed to be working. We told ourselves that whoever it was had given up, or that the police presence had scared them off. But deep down, I never believed it was over. One night, my dad called me and my mom into the living room. He looked serious, holding his phone in his hand. "You need to see this," he said, his voice low. He pulled up footage from one of the security cameras. It was from the night before, around 3 a.m. The video showed the front yard, illuminated by the motion-activated floodlight. At first, there was nothing, just the empty driveway and a faint breeze rustling the trees. Then he appeared. A man wearing the same white mask stepped into view. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the house. He stayed like that for almost an hour, completely still before turning and walking off into the darkness. "What the hell does he want?" my mom whispered, clutching my arm. My dad called the police again, but their response was the same. "We'll increase patrols in the area. Let us know if you see anything else." That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made my heart race. The idea that someone out there knew where I lived, knew my name, and had been inside my home. It was too much. The days turned into weeks, and then into months. The mask, the tapping, the staring, it all stopped. Or at least I thought it had. It's been years since everything happened. I'm an adult now, living on my own in Boston, far from that old house in Salem. Time has a way of dulling fear, but some things never leave you completely. I wish I could say I've moved on, but every so often, I catch myself checking my windows at night, double-checking the locks on my doors, listening for sounds I shouldn't hear. For the most part, life has been quiet. I've tried to convince myself that it was just some unhinged person who got bored and moved on. But part of me knows that's not the truth. A few weeks ago, I got home late after a long day at work. I was tired, just wanting to crash on the couch when I noticed something strange. There was an envelope sitting on my kitchen counter. I froze. I hadn't left anything there, and I lived alone. My heart pounded as I picked it up, hands trembling. There was no stamp, no return address. Just my name scrawled across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. I debated whether to open it or call the police, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single photo. It was an old picture of me as a kid, standing in my room back in Salem. My heart sank when I realized what was in the photo, a white mask lying on my bed, the same one from all those years ago. But that wasn't the worst part. On the back of the photo, written in the same messy handwriting, was a single sentence. "Nice to see you've moved on." I don't know how they found me. I don't know what they want. All I know is that I'm not safe. Not now, not ever. That night I slept with all the lights on, my phone clutched in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. Every sound felt like a threat, every shadow a warning. And now, every time I look out my window, I can't help but wonder if I'll see him again. Standing there, just watching, waiting for the right moment to remind me that he's still out there.